First of all, thank you very much for joining on and sacrificing your Friday afternoons for this session. Transnational Modern Languages, where now, where next? My name's Joe Ford, and I work here at the ILCS, the Institute for Languages, Cultures and Societies. I work in French Studies, and I've got the great pleasure of convening and chairing our Thinking Strategically seminar today. So just a quick word on the Thinking Strategically seminar, which brings together researchers in the subject community to discuss issues of major concern and to ensure that as a disciplinary community, we can have a joined up action at all levels for the future development of the study of languages and cultures. And after today's event on the launch of Transnational East Asian Studies and Transnational French Studies, we'll be announcing and circulating further events in this year's series. So please do keep an eye out for those. As you can see on the slide here, you've got a QR code there where you can look access our website and look at some of our events, find out about the Institute, look at some of the training that we host. And there's a second slide here, I'll click along, where you can access information about the Transnational Modern Languages book series, which is published by Liverpool University Press. There's also access to the open access book, Transnational Modern Languages, a handbook there, which you can download completely free of charge. I think now it's time really to open the session and a quick word on how today will work. We have 7 speakers. I'm delighted to welcome you all. You're going to talk for 5 minutes each on the question of where now, where next for transnational modern languages. We'll then move on to some follow-up questions from myself before opening up the discussion to the wider audience. And during the discussion, you can either raise your hand via Zoom and intervene live, as it were, or you could post your questions in the chat. Just to note that the session today is being recorded. So if you don't wish to appear on that recording, you should put any questions in the chat, and then I'll pick up those questions and put them to our invited speakers in the Q&A later today. Okay, so we'll go through all 7 contributions and then follow up with questions afterwards. So the next speaker is yasser elhariry, and I'll just introduce Yasser quickly. Yasser is Associate Professor of French at Dartmouth College, where he also teaches comparative literature, Middle Eastern studies, creative writing, and women's gender and sexuality studies. Yasser is the author of Pacifist Invasions, Arabic Translation, and the Post-Francophone Lyric, which came out with Liverpool University Press in 2017. And his essays appear across many leading journals and edited volumes. Co-edited volumes forthcoming in 2025 include Water Logics, that's with University of Virginia Press, Literature as Sound Studies with Bloomsbury, and Remembering Hospitality in the Mediterranean with Palgrave. And his next book is on the cultural history of wholes. Yasser, over to you.
So it's such a pleasure to be among longtime collaborators and colleagues, as well as friends, old and new. And thank you, Joe, for all of your amazing organizing for facilitating our gathering today. So I wanted to offer you a short debrief on Marwan Abdelhamid, better known as Saint Levant, the rakish, now 24-year-old trilingual rapping TikTok sensation who made headlines last year for his EP, From Gaza with Love. His follow-up Dira just dropped, and possibly of interest to some of you, he's playing in Glasgow tomorrow and Dublin on Tuesday. He was born in Jerusalem to a French-Algerian mother and a Palestinian-Serbian father. Spent his early childhood in Gaza before his family moved to Jordan. He studied in France, he lived in Los Angeles. In last year's feature in the New York Times, he evokes his heartbreaking dream to one day become president of Palestine and to open mental health clinics and found football clubs over there. Then he glosses the lyrical politics and poetics in these words. I don't claim to represent a country, but I do it for my country. I do it for my people, Abdelhamid, then 22, says. I didn't know that there was this many people that were trilingual or that were lost in their identity. It might not seem like much to us now, hearing his words, or that hearing his words, I've got a good decade, maybe two, on Saint Levant, yet I could never even have ever imagined articulating something as simple as, I didn't know that there was this many people that were trilingual or that were lost in their identity when I was 22. Saint Levant is not alone, and there's no shortage of transnational, translingual Arab artists, writers, and creators, from global icons like Bella Hadid to suffering Palestinian rappers like Shab Jdid or his producer Al Nasser, founder of the forward-looking Platinum record label. Therein lies a deeply unbearable quandary for the stateless and the nationless. I say unbearable because that is the title of my contribution to Charles Forsdick and Claire Launchbury's volume on Transnational French Studies, and I'm on the line with Karim Mata from the University of Colorado Boulder to co-edit the volume on Transnational Arabic Studies. We are delayed because the ongoing war in Gaza has taken a deep toll on everyone in Middle Eastern studies, but this volume cannot be more timely. Now, since we're here to think about where now, where next for transnational modern languages, my point here about Saint Levant is very simple, and a straightforward contrast between the state of Arabic and French studies will suffice to illustrate. For many people, it becomes very challenging to think of a non-national language, a language untethered from the nation. One of the peer reviewers for my essay Unbearable insisted that my contribution, and I quote, does not seem to fit in an edited volume devoted specifically to the problematic of transnationalism in France, and that my analysis does not, as it stands, contribute to debates about transnationalism in France. It does not indeed mention France at all. I take that as a point of pride. How can transnationalism take the nation as its focus? Of course, there are transnational dimensions within the boundaries of the nation, however porous, as Charles and Claire repeatedly remind the readers of their introduction. For me, the deep dissonance here is that there is an implicit equivalence between French and France that has no counterpoint for Arabic, which for me is a foundational bedrock that cannot be undone. There is Arabic, but there is no Republic of Arab in the way that there is a Republic of France for French. It's telling that the volume titles in the series go Transnational French Studies and not Transnational France Studies. I take none of this lightly. I know a great many colleagues who ruse Department of French in favor of Department of France. I swear they never have, nor will they ever read a word of Abdel Kabir Khatibi, who decades ago now said that la langue française n'est pas la langue française, staggering in its brutal simplicity, and I translate with liberty, French ain't French. So I conclude with this preliminary answer to where now, where next, that it's not a question of where, but when. We need to tackle head-on the false equivalence between language and nation, where the relationship of the heart of the matter should instead be language and art across time and across history. So very much echoing what Kevin just said. Transnationalism is emotional. It is historical, temporal, rather than geographical, spatial. Many of the characteristics that we now identify as transnational, movement, displacement, absorption, exchange, modulation, doubly cut through time, and were at play in earlier, pre-national moments as well, including moments where the national and the pre-national converged across the geographic expanse. That is precisely the story that I tell in Unbearable. There must exist today, despite assertions and the inevitable remedial concessions to the contrary, a nationalist transnationalism without the nation, without area studies, without the silos of individually labeled languages and nations. What, without reverting to world literature, would a truly nationalist, transnationalist, translingualist, transhistoricist volume look like? What, without defaulting to a Department of World Literatures and Languages, would a truly transnationalist, translingualist, transhistoricist university department look like? I'm in Switzerland right now. Do not ask me why, but riffing off Saint Levant, I leave you with these questions from Geneva with love.
Thank you so much, Yasser. That's wonderful. Charles, over to you. Charles Forsdick.
Thank you, Joe, and it's great to be following on from Yasser, who was one of the key contributors to the Transnational French Studies volume. I'm absolutely delighted to be taking part in this panel. This series and this initiative began as a large grant linked to the Arts and Humanities Research Council Translating Cultures theme, which ran from 2012 to 2018. And when that began, had we known that the project was going to take on these dimensions and have such momentum to it and allow us to ask those searching questions that yasser finished with, I don't think we'd quite believe the possible resonance there. The series, and we're getting a sense of it today, I think, has the potential to be this major intervention in modern languages across a broad range of different contexts. And I hope this will emerge from the conversations today, that there's a shared message across the volumes, and there are shared questions, not least some of those that yasser raised. And I think they're linked into this sense of urgency amongst those of us who teach languages, cultures, and societies, that we need to engage actively with the types of global challenges that have already been evoked. What interests me about this session, though, and it's an absolute honor to be talking with the editors of the East Asian volume, and also with having yasser here, the emerging Arabic volume, is that balance between a generic intervention, but also the language-specific considerations. And I think for students using these texts, one of the key questions that we need to pose to them is around the translatability, or probably more likely untranslatability, of the nation, and also of what the transnational means in relation to the nation. As you can imagine, for those of us working on French and France in particular, that has a particular resonance. In a way, in the French Francophone space, as elsewhere, the object of study has always already been transnational. Our volume opened with a brilliant chapter by our late lamented colleague Simon Gaunt on medieval France, the transnationalism beyond the nation, but clearly that always already transnational nature of things French has got to be balanced with that assimilative nature of the French Republic, with its universalist ideologies, which tend to foreground the nation still in ways that in other contexts, as yasser and Kevin indeed have suggested, is not necessarily the current default position. Our work, where are we now? Our work in the volume is partly a job of demythologization, taking icons of the national and indeed the nationalistic. The classic example we always cite is, in the French case, is the baguette, and trying to make the case for the baguette actually being this transnational item, the result of, in the 19th century, refined Hungarian flour, Viennese steam oven technology, Austrian compact yeast. There would not be the baguette without these transnational shifts in terms of ingredients and technology. So our starting point was introducing students really to that sense of demythologization of what we study. Where we're going next? Well, I think yasser's mentioned it already. One of the challenges in the French volume was thinking about France, particularly in relation to its overseas departments and regions. My chapter was largely on Martinique and on the toppling of statues in Martinique, and essays and reflections on the afterlives of slavery in the French Outre-mer. But I think where we go next is linked very much to what yasser was talking about, and that's thinking diglossically, thinking multilingually, extending beyond the French nation to look at the broader Francosphere. And just to give you an illustration of how that's in embryo, I think, in the volume already. Yasser's chapter he's talked about already. Max Silverman has a chapter on Lebanese cinema. Our cover photo, Claire might say a little bit about this, is a street in Beirut. And I think we want to move beyond our initial focus on the French nation and to introduce students to the intersections of the transnational with the post-colonial and, crucially, the neo-colonial. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Charles. That's great. And thank you again for keeping to time. And apologies for not introducing you. I've posted your bio in the chat for everyone to...
That's very kind of you, Joe. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Claire Launchbury. again, one of the editors of the French Studies volume, and whose research lies at the intersections of memory, language, resistance, and the archive in relation to contemporary Lebanon. Claire has a mixed professional background in academia, third sector, and non-governmental organizations, and has written political journalism for Le Monde Diplomatique and Le Monde. She trained in refugee care at the NHS Tavistock and Portman Trust. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you. I do have some slides that they're not integral, but it's just to give you some pictures. Let me just, so, and I'm following on, actually, it's just kind of coincidental that alphabetically Charles and I follow on from each other. But the extent to which the transnational has reinvigorated consideration of the nation state, which, as Charles was outlining, has certain specificities in relation to France in particular, but is also symptomatic, and I use the clinical metaphor advisedly, of many current ills. So my own chapter on transnational fraternité, with an attempt to test the limits of this Republican value, notably showing how the tenets of the law around contemporary political moves that reinforce or strengthen the borders, where the European and global north more broadly crisis of hospitality is configured. And the figure of Cédric Herru, whose legal cases were overturned by the courts, by the Conseil Constitutionnel on the basis of the application of fraternité in his militant activism in support of migrants. And it's one such extension of this idea of fraternité across the border. Fraternité itself is a limited gendered term, and that I suggest in my chapter particularly needs to open out to Paul Gilroy's sense of conviviality. And these issues of things such as transnational solidarity, fraternity, and conviviality are all the more urgent when, as is the case for me, my focus is on the. So this is the photo of the cover. It's been updated I took it when I was in Beirut last year. So my focus is on the epicenter of imperial violence, civilian killing, of genocide. Women, and especially race women, in our academic communities are drawing the urgent lines of kinship, frequently in the face of institutional indifference at best, or outright oppression at worst. And this talk here is a bit of an act of solidarity with my kinfolk in that. Beirut runs through our chapter, as Charles just said. It's on the cover. It runs through my chapter. It's funny, yasser, the external reader didn't like that either. In Max's chapter on memory, where he talks about a film called Je veux voir. And today marks the 81st anniversary of Lebanese independence from French mandatory power. And it's necessary for me to state this because the where next question cannot be framed solely in the institutional frames of research and teaching, although it's obviously integral. The limits of the transnational move towards the decolonial, and this word is being used and abused by many a failing academic institution at the Imperial Centre, needs to stop. Decolonization can only begin in registering the centrality of the plausible genocide taking place in Gaza alongside the long, slow violence of the occupation in Palestine, and acknowledging that this is done with the support of the global north in the US, the UK. That unchecked behaviour, impunity, and vicarious ambitions of the global hegemon, which have to date collaborated in the slaughter of 16,000 children, and the UN estimates currently that 3 children a day are being killed in Lebanon. And that is before the arrival of Trump version 2.0. My colleagues at the Académie des Beaux-Arts du Liban asked, how do we teach under the bombs? Comment enseigner sous les bombes? And my colleagues have lost students, and students whose family lands have been destroyed by white phosphorus, who are breathing in the deathly and deadly dust of the overnight explosions, where the sound, and in languages we are working in sound, of drones and bombs causes both physiological harms and manifest in an orality of violence. To bring it back to our volume and the pedagogic intentions, we asked provocations. For me, in terms of subjectivity and space, and both of these are challenging, unnecessarily so, because it involves interrogating our own complicity, our own positionality. In this context, holding the space as one of care and as one of acknowledging discomfort and of cultivating what Barry Mason has termed in the therapeutic space, Positions of safe uncertainty are paramount, acknowledging the effective, certainly, but also challenging the institutional frames, speaking out, speaking for. It requires a bravery that is frequently missing in frameworks where success is often achieved through sarcastic compliance with the most pernicious of neoliberal managerialism. It might be missing out on a promotion, a grant, an invitation. Where next needs to happen in the co-weaving, co-production and care that extends beyond the boundaries of institutions, that is informed by the communities we serve, that engages and registers our kinship in the development of commons, transnational decolonized commons. I actually have no idea how possible this is within the frames of current higher education, certainly in the UK, and I'm slightly more concerned with advocating from outside them. But my provocation here is to return to conceptualizations of transnational fraternité, kinship, and ask us as a community of scholars, how do we bear witness, advocate, challenge, and resist at times such as these? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for keeping to time. Okay, well, our next speaker is Douglas Smith. Douglas Smith teaches literature, film, and theory in the French and Francophone Studies section at University College Dublin. Recent publications include a co-edited special number of the Irish Journal of French Studies on Baudelaire's afterlives, a book chapter on Marseille in the work of Siegfried Krakauer and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and a special number of French studies co-edited with Ed Welsh exploring the French hexagon and its legacy. Over to you, Douglas.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you for all your work organising this symposium, and thank you for all the contributions so far, which have been really, really interesting. In particular, thank you to Claire and Charles, who were co-editor of the Transnational French Studies volume, to which I contributed a chapter. I want to talk a little bit about that, and then move on to talk briefly about possible moves beyond that. The chapter I wrote for Claire and Charles's volume was really part of that project of demythologization that was mentioned by Charles earlier, and it took as its subject really the widespread tendency in contemporary French culture to either depict visually or to refer verbally to the European territory of the French Republic as a hexagon. This practice seems to date back to German geography manuals of the 18th century, so there's already a transnational dimension. It doesn't come out of France, or it's not Franco-French in that sense. So German geography manuals of the 18th century, where it was based on the very approximate resemblance of the physical configuration of continental France to a six-sided geometrical figure. So composed of three coastal frontiers, the Channel, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and three land frontiers, the Pyrenees, the Alps, and the Rhine. The hexagon has never been a part of the official iconography of the French Republic, but in the late 19th century, its graphic form was integrated into the centralized pedagogy of the Third Republic, as the hexagon was widely used as a heuristic device in order to teach school children how to draw a basic map of the national territory. As an easily memorable and reproducible image of the nation, the hexagon represents what Benedict Anderson in Imaginary Communities called the, quote, logoization of political space, unquote. In the late 19th century then, the hexagon played a part in the reconstruction of French national identity in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War. In the mid-20th century, it played a similar role in the emergence of the Fifth Republic from the wars of decolonization in Southeast Asia and Algeria. From the 1960s on, the hexagon came to symbolize a metropolitan France that had left its colonial imperial past to commit itself to a process of transforming itself into a modern European economy. The hexagon then became an emblem of what Todd Shepard has called the invention of decolonization, not least in the way in which it edited out the remaining overseas departments and regions that, together with metropolitan France, constitute the French Republic since the 1960s. Whether in the visual form of graphic design or in the verbal form of journalistic discourse, the hexagon has since become a pervasive and largely invisible symbol of French national identity. While there's been some work done on the history and origins of the hexagon, notably by the historians Nathaniel Smith and Eugen Weber, as well as the French social geographer Marie-Claire Robic, more recent discussions have sometimes tended to assume the hexagon as a kind of straw target, an ideological fiction to be dismissed out of hand. As such, the hexagon has received little sustained attention. The main exception to this, which I'd like to mention here, is a 2011 volume of essays edited by Joe McCormick, Alistair Rose, and Murray Pratt, and entitled Hexagonal Variations, which, as its title suggests, sought instead to explore the multiple angles of the hexagon in a more nuanced way. So my chapter was intended to build on this existing work and to examine how the hexagon operates ideologically in terms derived in part from Louis Althusser. So considering the hexagon as an imaginary reconciliation of some of the key contradictions of French nationalist discourse. To take one example, the hexagon allows the nation to appear unified and diverse at the same time in terms of both its physical and human geography, symbolized in a single geometric form that nonetheless incorporates multiple sides and angles. While it's often the case that one term of the ideological contradiction dominates the other, it's also possible to play the supposedly weaker term against the stronger. Thus, there's a tendency to privilege the unity of the hexagon against its diversity. But the image of the hexagon can also be used to push back against a monolithic definition of national identity by stressing the manifold internal differences and outward-facing relationships that characterize French society. In terms of current or ongoing work, it seems clear that we're in an era of resurgent nationalism and hardening borders, and that in that context, one of the tasks of transnational studies is to continue with its project of demythologization of the nation state, its discourses and its iconography. But there are also other possible avenues to explore and pursue. One is to further study the internal diversity of nation states, notably through translingualism, the use of multiple or mixed languages on the part of certain communities. Another possible way forward, this is a bit more the French context, but is actually to explore minor transnationalisms, so to bypass the hexagon by investigating the Francosphere, the peripheral, in inverted commas, Francosphere. And finally, to echo what Julia just said, really the possibility of going in a more regional direction and looking at a wider collection of, or the relationships between a wider range of nation states. So thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Douglas. And again, yeah, thanks so much for sticking to time. So our final speaker today is Till Weingärtner, who is a senior lecturer in Japanese studies at University College Cork, with a research focus on Japanese comedy and film. Till has also been an active comedian in Japan in the past and still performs rakugo, a Japanese comedic storytelling in Japanese, English, and German. So over to you, Till.
Yes, thank you very much. Unfortunately, not much to laugh about in my presentation today. I've got some slides which I'm going to share, so I hope you can see them now. Okay. So what I was thinking about resonates with what Charles has mentioned. How do we bring these questions to the students, but also to what Julia has been said, how are our disciplines actually situated in the university and what units do we work? And of course, myself coming from Japanese studies, I've mostly reflected on my own situation. So of course, when we talk to our students about Japan or any Asian country, indeed, of course, we do talk about China. We do mention the influence of China. But engaging with these transnational questions, maybe in a fruitful manner, is very tricky due to the language barriers. Students rarely achieve fluency in 2 Asian languages during their courses. You could maybe argue that's more easy in some European languages. But also many of the people who are teaching, and that includes me, might only be proficient in one of the languages involved. So few scholars can actually work on transnational questions alone. Collaboration is key. And this is why it's wonderful to come together to work on a volume like this. And indeed, Transnational East Asian Studies is sort of the child of a module that Kevin Corley organized at UCC, where many colleagues came together and talked to our students. So in my experience in the classroom, when we talk about transnational questions, we tend to, and I'm guilty of that myself, we sort of tend to present them as historical facts. So when I teach my course on Introduction to Japanese Culture and Literature, of course I discuss the significance of Chinese literature, Chinese learning that came across the water with Korean scholars, and how that had an impact on Japanese literature. But I probably get trapped then myself not to follow up on that and engage students and think about Japanese culture and what it means for that. So I think a volume like Transnational East Asian Studies can be very fruitful in the classroom because it brings together scholars from different backgrounds, discussing individual cases, and also introducing the students to the richness and complexity of transnational phenomena and making them more aware of where they occur and how we can actually study them, how we can talk about them through, and that's from the blurb of the book, but I like that, through transnationalism as a mode of intellectual inquiry with wide-ranging interdisciplinary potential. So, for example, when we look at Japanese cinema in Japanese studies or in film studies, we can see that in the past, the Japanese film was often constructed and enforced around the idea of Japanese cinema as a national cinema, indeed marginalizing transnational questions. And in Kurosawa Film Studies in Japanese Cinema, Mitsuhiro Yoshimoto traces the Anglophone, mostly the US scholarship on Japanese cinema, arguing it relied heavily on the idea of national cinema. And he identifies three phases: the humanist celebration of Japanese auteurs in the 1960s, formalist and Marxist approaches in the 1970s, focusing on differences from Hollywood, and cross-cultural analysis of otherness discourses in the 1980s. But nevertheless, each phase constructed a fixed image of Japanese cinema as a distinct national entity, often leading to stereotypical interpretations based on essentialized notions of Japaneseness. Yoshimoto highlights that framing Japanese cinema as a national cinema was shaped by film studies' reliance on national cinema as a strategy of containment. In contrast, in more recent times, we have authors like Yomota Inohiko in What is Japanese Cinema, translated by Philip Caffin in 2019. The book itself is a bit older, but this is the release of the English version. He acknowledges the limitations of the national cinema framework amid increasing transnational film production. Yomota here argues that Japanese cinema is a dynamic hybrid form shaped by diverse cultural influences, and he provides examples of films mixing Japanese and Western elements or featuring collaboration with foreign filmmakers. Now, in my own chapter in this book, I examine filmmaker Yang Yong-hee, who is a member of the Zainichi Koreans, so the Korean minority residing in Japan. And I think Yang's films exemplify transnational cinema, challenging the national cinema framework, dominating discussions of Japanese and possibly also South Korean film. As a Zainichi Korean, Yang occupies a space between Japan and Korea. Her films focus on families, and specifically her own family, divided by national borders, reflecting her experience and highlighting the complexities of national identities. And by showing us instances of code switching between Korean, Japanese, and Osaka dialect, so maybe there are actually three languages at least in the book, her films embody a hybrid identity that defies easy categorization. And I think a case study like this, and it doesn't have to be mine, of course, but case studies like this can also help us to guide students to go back to these old examples of scholarships and also start challenging them and thinking how these case studies that we can discuss in the classroom then align with these bigger ideas of Yoshimoto's critique of essentializing cultures, cultural differences, or how that might resonate with Yoshimoto's perspectives on the fluidity of Japanese cinemas. So to just summarize, I think these importance are, of course, relevant for us, but I think we as, not just as scholars, but indeed as teachers, can do with a helping hand in the classroom and with a wide variety of examples to make it interesting for the students to grapple these complex issues. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Till. That's wonderful. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I think that was a real kind of tour de force, and thank you, everyone, for sticking to time, which now means we do have a bit of time for discussion, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, as I said. And one of the I'm glad, Till, you talked about students there, and certainly some of the other speakers mentioned students and the understanding of a concept like transnationalism. This kind of leads into something that I was picking up on when I was reading all of the chapters that I read in preparation for today, which is to say, all of your chapters. I think there's something that kind of came to me, a question that came to me that struck me as kind of recurring across all of those chapters, is that they really exemplify the transnational as always already present in a kind of local and micro-historical, a kind of grounded or vernacular history or poetics of the everyday. And I think we see that across the two volumes. But I think to some extent what was coming across to me was that the transnational, with that definition, has been covered over through various ideological lenses. It's not necessarily, it's not necessarily been seen in relation to the local, for instance. It's been seen in relation to kind of discourses of globalization that come through perhaps other disciplines but our own. But there's something very specific, I think, that languages and cultures and a languages and cultures education tries to bring through that notion of the transnational. So I think the located transnational, if you know what I mean, the grounded transnational, and the way it can move between the local and the global, and create new understandings of those two terms, those two ideas in the process. So I suppose my first question to you all is really, how can researchers such as yourselves, and perhaps particularly researchers who know the world through languages and cultures, how can we continue to uncover the layers of historical reality that have been kind of covered over, and that, you know, these books do go some way to do that, but I'd be interested in your thoughts, I mean, particularly with a view to the where next of the series, on that question of the transnational, and indeed whether the transnational as a term in and of itself is appropriate, is the kind of framework through which we can take that forward into the future. So I'm going to invite anyone to contribute. So please do unmute or raise your hand, but any one of the panelists, that is. So I'll kind of open the floor to the panelists for now. Does anyone want to answer that first? Perhaps I need to pick on someone. Claire.
Thank you, Joe, for this. I think, this is something that Charles and I discussed, and I just as you were talking, I was thinking of sort of Charles's work and the links, for example, between Brittany and the Republic of Ireland in relation to that, and I think we have been alert to that, and thinking through about those, how the local translates into the global, and is and of. I think for me, I think the transnational is probably hitting its boundaries. I think, you know, it goes so far, and I think that's what I was pointing to when we're thinking about actually the comments that Yasser and I received from our external readers who objected to Beirut and Belfast in my chapter, and that actually, you know, it's not. Because it's so sort of, because it still has the national within it. How do we then move beyond that? And I'm sort of quite polemic around the way certain institutions employ decolonization. Having worked for an NGO where decolonization would have literally meant the sort of deconstruction of itself. I mean, it was aware of that, but you know, it does basically, decolonization would dismantle many of the institutions to which we adhere professionally. But do we, how, and I don't think there's a neat slippage from or segue from transnational into decolonizing. The thing has to be much more radical. It's about finding those sources of power wherever they are, and understanding how they can be dismantled. Does that go some way to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely, Claire. Thank you. I mean, one other, I can see Yasser, you've got your hand up. So do you want to follow up on that?
Sure, maybe very briefly, just in an attempt to answer your questions. What can researchers do? I guess I have a radical and a less radical response. The less radical one, which is still quite a bit of a challenge, goes back to something that Teal mentioned, which is, I quote him, it's rare for students to achieve fluency in 2 Asian languages in their courses. Maybe it's easier in European languages, but I mean, in my experience, it is very difficult for students. It's difficult for myself. It's difficult for colleagues. But I do believe proficiency in more than one linguistic tradition goes a long way to undoing the national. But I guess the more, so that's methodological, that's in terms of pedagogy, that's in terms of what we do as researchers, as readers, as writers, reading between languages, writing between languages. The more radical approach would be to do away with nations altogether. I mean, the transnational doesn't quite do away with the national category. And so, yeah, maybe that we are kind of hitting a limit in a way. But that's why also thinking about things transhistorically, going back to pre-national moments and seeing how cultural artifacts circulate, liberates us in a way from, I forget who said, someone talked about the constriction of the nation, of the category. So yeah, just 2 thoughts.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Yasser. And I think it comes across very much in your own chapter when you're thinking about the transnational, and in many other chapters actually, where the transnational as a kind of prior, way back. This is not something that's new, in a sense. So thank you for that. Charles, got your hand up.
Thanks, Joe. If I just come back to something I mentioned, which is that question of translatability, untranslatability, and making sure we take this key word, the nation, which is so important for all of us who teach languages, cultures, and societies, and make sure that we are, as I think we've demonstrated in this session so far, we're bringing it back to the specific contexts in which the nation is constructed and deployed. Because I think in thinking about the Francosphere, getting rid of the nation in a place like Haiti would be a perilous maneuver. Haiti is a place which is a nation without a state, really, with no infrastructure, and we've got to remember that there are in some contexts where the nation, if constructed appropriately, in that case, on the principles of independence in 1804, it is a major bulwark against external intervention and internal integration. So I think that those are the sort of questions within a French Francophone context that I'm trying to use our book to introduce these sort of key issues to students. Joe, in response to your question, I think what's exciting about this series, notwithstanding the really important issues, I think, about coverage and content that Julia raised, is on the one hand, it's a challenge to say, is the transnational a phenomenon? Is it an object of study? Can we find, and Douglas mentioned this, again, to be quite parochial and think about the French case, can we find examples of translingual exophonic writing in French, which in many ways exemplify the transnational in terms of authors from China or Greece or Japan or Hungary or wherever, migrating physically and linguistically to French and producing literature in the French language? So that there's this sort of the explicitly transnational phenomenon. But at the same time, I think there's the transnational as an optic, as a perspective, as a as an approach, as a methodology. And when Claire and I were working on this volume, one of our major inspirations was the historian, late now historian Tyler Stovall, who worked very closely on the idea of transnational history of France. And his argument was very much that this is to do with a way of approaching an object of study, which, as you suggested, Joe, might then lead to teasing out the transnational in what is ostensibly or ideologically national. And that for me is one of the key points. Going back to Julia's, I think, very helpful reflections, is that one of the key roles of this series in modern languages, as we've inherited it, which is to do with the teaching of imperial languages for historical reasons with which we're all familiar, the hierarchies of language, and the marginalization of major world languages within the academy to which Julia referred. Within that context, I think this series is about challenging methodological nationalism, and it's also about challenging ideological monolingualism. And that sort of transnational optic, for me, helps us to support those two aims. And in terms of Julia's reflections, I think one of the issues with this series, and there are a number of the colleagues who were involved in very early discussions, is around what's the aim here? It's to do with the sociology of knowledge production. It's also to do with the economics of knowledge production. And we often don't talk about it, but it's to do with commercial viability as well, and how these volumes are going to find an audience. I think one of the key things I'd say, and that's why I really appreciate this session, is this is very much an evolutionary process. So to a certain extent, we started with the obvious candidates: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Italian, German, simply because at the moment, those are the key base within the Anglophone world in modern languages or language-based area studies. The problem is obviously that base is crumbling rapidly before our eyes. Not just in Great Britain, I know elsewhere in Australia, we're seeing departments closed, we're seeing colleagues made redundant or redeployed. So I like to see this series as a practical intervention in a rapidly changing set of disciplinary challenges, which is around rethinking not just the way we study languages, cultures, and societies, but also picking up Julia's challenge, making sure the languages, cultures, societies we study are the ones that we should be studying, so that we can navigate effectively the challenges of the 21st century world that a number of colleagues have alluded to.
Thank you, Charles. And perhaps I could just ask a follow-up question there, because, and this is for everyone, in terms of what Charles has just said about departmental closures, redeployments, reconfigurations, I mean, it's something that I picked up, I think, in the introduction to the East Asian Studies volume, Julia and Kevin, around actually the kind of different position of language learning from, say, French, a fall in European languages, French and other European languages, and East Asian languages. So I just wanted to pick up on that. And is there, I mean, how does it look within East Asian studies, I suppose, is my question, by comparison with the situation in European languages? I wondered, could you, Kevin or Julia, or one of the East Asian studies colleagues, comment on that at all? Yeah, thank you. Till.
Yes, I mean, I can only say I totally agree to that. I mean, coming to Ireland actually from the continent was quite an interesting experience, because in Ireland, I think all the East Asian languages are still comparably new as an academic field of study. And I think in our university, and maybe to some degree in UCD, it's similar. You can kind of see these phases of interest. So when I joined the university, I think there was much interest in Chinese studies from the point of view that it would bring much potential for business. And indeed, the business program with Chinese has now disappeared because there's more skepticism about that. So I don't even think there is much of a strategy in place. It's sort of these, suddenly something looks new and shiny maybe, and then everyone is very enthusiastic. And at certain points we can get funding from abroad because China's interested in getting us a Confucius Institute, and maybe Japan and Korea, they will fund language teaching for a time. But in the end, the university might not even be giving us the language teaching that we might need. And we might not get the support that the students would deserve for learning these languages.
Yeah, thank you, Till. Yeah, it's a difficult picture, I think, across the sector, and I can point, and we may discuss this during the Q&A, to some of the work we've been doing around connecting with policymakers and trying to make the case for languages, and precisely for that strategic oversight. But it's far from certain what the outcome of those conversations are. I wanted, if I may, just to move on to a final thought, and then we'll open up to Q&A from the audience. I think it's been mentioned both in Claire's contribution today and Yasser's contribution. I suppose thinking again about that question of where next. I was looking at the chapter in a handbook by Monica Seeger on futures, and I was kind of interested to. Monica talks about the future as grounded in the present, and I think it's back in 2021. Monica's talking about the way in which, and I'm quoting, that present feels rather turbulent worldwide. And today, I think, we're not only faced with what Seeger identifies as the need to, and again, I'm quoting, make sense of our most urgent and overwhelming present realities, and that Seeger's talking about in relation to the future of planetary existence. But of course, the way in which that planetary existence is violently taken away from particular human beings, from non-humans, from environments, and indeed the ways discourses are shaped to re-render human life unlivable, and re-render human life as non-human. And as such, I'm thinking about when we get to that question of where next, it's not exactly easy as languages and culture scholars to see where anything or anyone goes from here. And I think given that kind of crisis of futurity, particularly when we look at the structures that govern us, and even their kind of incapacity to do anything about the horrors of Gaza, of Lebanon, of Ukraine, of Yemen, of the Mediterranean, of the seemingly powerlessness of the United Nations, or the ICC, the institutions, again, that govern us, to curtail the violence. It's not exactly easy to talk about the seemingly kind of disconnected scholarship in some ways that we take our time in writing, and perhaps rightfully so that we take our time in considering and writing scholarship within a book series such as this. But I suppose I feel there's a question, perhaps an unanswerable question in some ways, about the challenges we face as a discipline, which we've been mentioning here today, and really where we feel our collective work as languages and culture scholars has to go next within this space. And so I just wanted, I suppose, before opening to Q&A, to kind of bring that question up of the context in which we're living, and the importance, I suppose, that we put on languages and cultures research, or indeed, as Claire's mentioned, where we might want to step out of the academy and think about our work in a much wider context. So I wanted to open that question up to anyone on the panel who would like to take it. Thank you.
I can add some more if you want, Joe. I mean, I am probably the only member of the panel who is actually literally outside the academy at the moment, as in I'm not employed by it. I have an honorary fellowship at Leeds. So my skin isn't quite so much in the game anymore. But I think, having attended two very important things recently, the there was on Saturday last week a study day about resisting ecocide hosted in Beirut, hosted in Lebanon, and it was very much it was students who were asking, who had asked for it, who were reading poems, French poems by Nadia Toueni, etc., and the call was from them to participate, and the call was from colleagues there to participate, and I think that interior call from places, from sites, from Gaza, from Palestine, from Lebanon is one that we attend to, and the second one was a wonderful seminar in the International Studies Association, Australian based. Now, just as a complete aside, when I did teach in Australia, French was very much the minority subject compared to Chinese and Korean, and my colleagues in East Asian Studies. So I have experienced the inverse of it from European sort of language dominance. That aside, my colleague Jumana Baye, who works on diaspora literature, and a very wonderful First Nations scholar called Sarah Motta, were talking about these lines of kinship, but talking about how you work with communities, not as a sort of not sort of paternalistic knowledge exchange stuff, but really sort of getting in and co-creating, co-weaving, co-forming new political realities. And they are acting because their institutions are making their lives so uncomfortable and so difficult. If you're a racialized Australian, if you're a Lebanese Australian currently in many institutions, your life is not made very, very easy through for lots of reasons. So there's a sense in which people are being forced out of the institution, because the institution is either indifferent or, much worse, hostile to the presence of what they have to say within that. So I think it's really critical that we, within language, cultures, societies, attend to our duty, which is beyond the walls, and articulate, even from the global north, the very act of bearing witness to something is something. But that we are mindful of our positionality, of our potential complicity, of how we engage with these very real realities in the world, and that we put ourselves on the line for it, because it's not comfortable. Institutions don't like it. It's not a nice, easy place to inhabit, and it's challenging. And I was anxious about talking about like this today, because it's like, do I ever want to go back on the job market? Am I putting things on the line by doing so? No, it's more important than that. It's more important than the institution of academia. And I think that when we're pushing towards it, when we're pushing towards and out of this, Sarah Motta talks about co-weaving, and she uses the weaving metaphor because it's like the fabric of society. There's something texturally important about that engagement outside and beyond, and that, I think, is where, if we have any hope of ethical continuity, ethical, meaningful continuity, it has to be through that. And I mean, part of me wants to just burn it all down. But I'm not sure you can reform the institutions. I'm not at a point where I think you can reform the institutions. So where do we go from here? It's got to be challenging and uncomfortable. These are not comfortable positions to contemplate. Does that help?
It does, Claire. Yeah, it helps a lot. Thank you so much. Did anyone else want to come in on that question before we open up?
I hesitate, but maybe I can jump in, just inspired by what Claire was saying. I love that she mentioned the Lebanese poet Nadia Toueni, who was pretty much forgotten, rarely figures on reading lists in Francophone post-colonial studies. French Lebanese poet of French expression, who wrote a number of quite arresting poems about civil wars, destroyed bodies, destroyed buildings that are just sort of laid out on the page as a way of witnessing, as a way of honoring, as a way of remembering, which is ironic given the sort of the forgetfulness to which her legacy has her writings have succumbed, perhaps to the exception of Lebanon or within Lebanon itself. So I do think I have much more modest aspirations for the kind of work and the ethics and the dedication as a writer that I have for myself and that I have. I think we should be mischievous and continue to be a thorn in the side of the institution. And that means breaking the rules. That means seeing how much we can get away in our writing, because that does end up being a part of a record, right? The nation isn't going anywhere, but all of the annoying people like myself, like all of the Black singers in France, Aya Nakamura most recently, as was this highly publicized case around the Olympics in Paris. We're always going to be there. We're always going to remind you, to quote, I don't know, Alanis Morissette, of the mess that you left behind you in your wake, whether it's the mess of colonialism that we're still dealing with, the messes of nations that we are all dealing with, given the horrors of the world, as you're saying, Joe. So I don't know. We're here to remember. We're here not to forget. We're here to break the rules, to be a thorn in the side of the institution, and to keep doing it until we end up on the chopping block, I guess. I mean, this is also a reality in the United States, right? It's not just in Australia and the UK, Charles, and we're constantly facing course cuts, even at a supposedly it is a privileged insular institution like Dartmouth that is private, that isn't subject to the scrutiny and the public funding that other institutions have to go through. But we're constantly being squeezed in many ways, and we will be squeezed to disappearance. So I don't have any disillusions about that. But in the meantime, we're here, and we should write, and we should keep writing, so that people like Nadia Twaini don't disappear.
Thank you, Yasser. Yeah, I appreciate that. In the meantime, we will do the things that we have been doing and push on with those. Any other comments before we open up? Charles, thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Joe, just going back to your question, really, it's clearly you articulated a challenge to the humanities more broadly, and the pressure on language-based area studies we're talking about, and you're quite right to insist, so this is a phenomenon across the Anglophone world, is replicated across other humanities subjects too. I think the challenge for us, though, and this is the opportunity afforded by the series, is to reflect on what specifically do linguistically sensitive approaches to the world underpinning our disciplines allow. And Yasser's idea of this thorn on the side of the institution, and we could have a long discussion about being inside, being outside, and what's more effective, and the complementarity of those two. But something about what we do is to remind not just our institutions, but the wider sort of polity of which we form a part of the inconvenience of multilingualism in a world which increasingly seeks through policy, through technology, monolingual efficiency. Ours are disciplines which foreground the frictions of cultural opacity and untranslatability. And I think what the challenge, I think, for languages is to reflect on that specificity within a broader humanities space. And I think this is, I think Claire's alluded to it. I think Yasser's alluded to it as well. In some ways, this is about epistemic justice, complementing other forms of justice, challenging not just Anglocentrism, but also Anglo-normativity. and the way in which thinking from one part of the world, this goes back exactly to what Julie was saying, thinking in certain languages, knowledge in certain languages is seen as more valuable than thinking and knowledge in other languages. So I think, and this is what I see underpinning the series, is that commitment to epistemic justice. I think there's also something on the ground which is to do with exposing and challenging linguophobia, and the way in which people who speak certain languages, or people who speak certain languages in certain ways, are marginalized and excluded from power. And I think there are larger issues here as well about the processes of linguicide. And I think we have a responsibility as students of language or languages to look at the extent to which languages itself as repositories of knowledge and as means of forming community are themselves increasingly under threat. What does that look like? Well, I don't think it means signing up for global citizenship and other concepts that are easily recuperated, like intercultural knowledge, that are easily recuperated and recycled. I think, and my view on this is very much driven by my students. And what I love about the students I teach is they're often in the vanguard of thinking in these areas. They're one step ahead of somebody who's been around for 3 decades like me. And what they're interested in, many of my students, is forms of dwelling in sustainable ways. They're not interested in the UN Strategic Development Goals and what they look like. They're interested in what it means to be a responsible citizen, and what that means to do with forms of coexistence with the world and coexistence with each other. And it sounds, the risk is that becomes a utopian project, I know, but I think a number of our students are grounding those questions very much in immediate forms of activism. One of the challenges for us as instructors and researchers and teachers is to reflect on how the work we're doing can support that.
Thank you, Charles. Any other final reflections on that question before we open the floor? If not, I'm happy to open the floor. If there are any questions from the audience, please feel free to raise your hand or to post in the chat. I can see things are coming in the chat. Thank you very much. If anyone wants to come in while I read the questions in the chat and process them and put them to speakers, then please do. You should be able to unmute yourselves if you'd like to come in. Hugo, I can see your yeah.
Yes, I would like to thank you, all the speakers, I was looking forward to this session on a Friday afternoon. This was not sacrificed. Each of you from different areas have been kind of kindling and crystallizing all our worries, our interests, but also reflecting the state of the world, which is very interesting for once attending a conference, which is really in sync with what we are living through. And it's not always the case. But I was thinking that maybe one of the hopeful things we could do, and there's a wonderful phrase saying that we got hope so that we can reach the unhoped for. Nous avons l'espérance pour atteindre l'inespéré. That comes from an Algerian poet. And I think one of the missions that all of us in our different areas, through the transnational optic, but also through languages, is to make sure to counteract the negativity affecting our institutions and in terms of recruitment as well, is to make sure that through books, through film, through music, that we kindle this interest in the wider public, which means our students and their younger siblings, as Charles was saying. That is, when there is an interest in film, in poetry, in books, they will by necessity go beyond what they just have access to, W.S. Smith or whatever is around them. And it's through that we can rekindle the interest in languages. And then, of course, that is always going to go through the transnational. And to do that is really to work with publishers. to work with access to books, access to film, access to culture. If there's no access to that, we will die out, definitely, because Trump will win. They are creating a desert there. And we know that without art and culture, which is not a luxury and should never be an elitist culture, we are dead in the water. A good example of that, I'm holding this book. Algeria is related to what Claire was saying, to all of you were saying. It could have been Kurosawa. It could have been Korean cinema of the 90s. It could have been a wonderful kind of Japanese filmmaker who actually shot films about China. It's Algérie à 50 ans. You see, and actually there are two sides to it. I don't know if some of you know that. It's one of the key feminist editions published by Étoile d'encre, Revue trimestrielle de femmes en Méditerranée. So read my words, Revue trimestrielle, and you'll see, it's an amazing, and sort of a series of books, with poets. Some of them died, like Alice Grécry, Christiana Schur, Hélène Sixou, Leila Sebar, Malika Mokedem, and so on and so forth. It's an incredible, and it's historical, it's literary, it's diaries, and it's about all the things we're studying. And again, this is this type of creativity, which actually there will be other examples of that. It's completely transnational, also completely national in a way. They all come together, and it's poetry, it's archives, incredible artwork, photographies, dealing with all. And this 2012. This issue is from 2012, and to me, these are the types of books of creativity that we need to push forward, and make kind of students and new generation aware of, and they will come and they will want to study the languages and to bouleverser, what we're doing. So this really, what I want to say, to go beyond the national and on the transnational, is to go to rekindle the interest in knowledge, the books, transmedially as well. And that's the only hope we can do, because then, people will want to study the language and they will see that it's always automatically transnational. It's never national. So we have to deconstruct the national through culture and poetry, which is never purely national. And that's maybe one thing. And the last point is, yes, I was thinking, is transnational not political enough? That's the question I was asking, hitting the borders and boundaries. It's a good one, because the opposite is renationalizing studies, which is actually what we're living through. Renationalizing languages will be a disaster, but that's what we are living through. So it is not obviously political, but it is very subtly political in that sense. That's all I wanted to say, but thanking all the speakers for and the collection for the lucid. I think it's going to live on and evolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo, for your intervention. Would anyone like to come back on that? Maureen, did you want to speak?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I dropped these notes. I didn't realise how dark it was going to get this time of day. But I just wonder whether or not, on a very practical level, whether we're sort of, excuse the expression, but selling languages as much as we perhaps could. I mean, there's a very practical level of, okay, communication, yes, and I know we have technological machines that can do that to a certain extent, but in a big hotel in London, we still need people who can, communicate with all the tourists coming in and this sort of thing. We need people who can translate so that engineering and ideas and science, etc., can, be multinational rather than just national, which they're not, of course, but I mean, more and more ideas shared. I mean, look at COVID, we needed to share scientific knowledge at that point quite a lot. to how to practical things of how to sell to a particular culture, people in a particular culture, to how to avoid conflict with people in a particular culture, and even warfare. So that in a very practical way, rather than just an ideological way, because I'm interested in literature as well. Do we need to sort of emphasize these issues of basic communication a bit more, and all the areas in which it's important, written and spoken.
Yeah, thank you, Maureen. Did anyone want to come back on that? Any of the panelists in particular? I think one of the questions sorry, Charles, go ahead. I saw you unmuted yourself.
Say something about this, because I think we're thinking from our specific national context, and we've got Great Britain, we've got Ireland, we've got the US recognised here. We're in the UK, new government, new opportunity to reflect on the function of languages within debates over education and skills, but more broadly as well. And I in response to Maureen, I think when we're talking about languages across education, it's very clear that we need to be reflecting on this almost as the entry point, questions of communication, questions of oracy, questions of ensuring either that we're teaching people additional languages, or we're acknowledging and supporting the fact they already speak other languages. They have home languages in addition to English. So I think it's a point that we need to take on board in terms of the future of our disciplinary areas. But at the same time, if we overemphasize that, we lose the fact that I think we believe from primary school onwards, this is about the integrated study of languages and cultures. And even though we're talking about a spectrum of levels of linguistic competence, inevitably, whatever level we're talking about, that communication needs to be grounded to a lesser or greater extent in the forms of study of culture and society that interest us. And I think this project is very much about giving additional skills of criticality, so that studying the cultures in which the languages we teach or learn are situated are understood in more complex ways that fit into the reconfigurations that many of the other panelists have been talking about in the 21st century.
Thank you, Charles. Charles Bidette, do you want to come in, and then I'll pick up a couple of questions from the chat?
Yeah, just to go back on a couple of things. I think absolutely the points Julia was making about the imperial structures that we inhabit, they are there, and you cannot wish them away. As Charles said, in some respects you inherit these structures, but they're also there in the sense of educational sector, associations, journals, conferences, students, governmental frameworks. They're there, and the question is, it's very, very difficult, if not to say impossible, to start from a kind of way of how you would like things to be. So there are pragmatic considerations in a way a series can actually take off. And again, to refer back to what Charles was saying, it starts, or the project started very much in the context of modern languages and how they are constituted, certainly in the UK. That's where it was based. It was funded by a UK funding agency. And I think the thing is, you can, for example, study Italian, and that's the first volume, which was actually commissioned in 2015. So it is showing its signs of age. You can study Italian if you look at it in global perspective. That is, if you are talking about settler colonialism, you're talking in South America, you're talking about colonialism in Africa, you're talking about migration, you're talking about the right-wing backlash that there is in Italy at the moment, and if you're seeing Italy as a place of cultural mixing over millennia. So I think the intervention of the series is to take existing structures, but very much attempt to accelerate their development. The idea is also very much that they are pedagogical volumes. They are about not simply research volumes. They're about trying to write in such a way that students understand the issues of a disciplinary framework, its complicities, its dangers, and at the same time as you're constructing a disciplinary framework, you're also deconstructing it, and that you are bringing some of the questions that Claire and Yasser have spoken very powerfully about to the very start of any disciplinary study. And I think that was an aim of the series from the start. And that, of course, that the series develops as one is using whatever institutional and other power one has to change the disciplinary structures, make them more global, make them more inclusive. For example, when we're talking about the very concept of modern languages, we've changed the name of the institute, we changed its mission statement, we've done an enormous amount of work in connecting with community heritage and home languages. There is also the project that followed on was the Open World Research Initiative. And indeed, that is that push, both as an intervention that is a publishing and pedagogical intervention, is something that is accompanied by a will for change and whatever action one can perform, both institutionally and non-institutionally, towards creating a disciplinary framework that we are more happy with, and which certainly reflects upon our own complicities. There is one point, and that is that one can, in fact, be tempted to tear the whole structure down. I have a certain sympathy with that approach. But in some ways, being involved in the way in which universities are downsizing their languages program, they are downsizing their humanities program, certainly in the UK. Some of the alternatives that do come up tend to be very utilitarian, instrumental, not interested in cultural critique, not interested in deep critical thinking, and not interested in developing a global perspective, except perhaps offering very generic courses that are delivered in English. And they have all sorts of problems as well. So I think, yes, my intervention is about accelerating change within institutional structures with a very strong sense of, as Claire has said, the political urgency of creating structures that are more adequate to some of the horrific challenges that we face.
Thank you, Charles. Richard, do you want to come in, and then I'll go to the chat?
Thank you, Joe, and thanks very much to everybody for speaking today. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and it's great that we've had enough time to let everybody speak and respond to one another. And this is a very small, specific point about where the book and the series and the volume might go from here, and perhaps a slightly more optimistic view of the future of teaching of modern languages in one sense is that thinking about the use of the book and the way that universities and libraries now often organize their book ordering, so that if you want to order a book, they'll say, well, how many students on these courses are going to be using these particular books? So a very utilitarian version. But of course, a book series like this needs to be on every introductory course, but it also needs to be on every final year dissertation course, because we don't know what students are going to be writing their dissertations on when they come in. But whatever they decide to do, this is the type of book that they need to be looking at. So I think that's one way in which we can integrate it into a reduced teaching thing, where some of us have fewer students, fewer single honours students, also students who have fewer modules. We can actually turn that perhaps to our advantage and say, well, if you're studying French, in my case, at any particular level, this is the type of book that you need to look at, and you need to look at it and you need to think about French in this context and learn more about what French means and what Francophone studies mean. And if we do that with students in the first year, whatever they might do in the second year on their year abroad, they've always got that to come back to when they think about their dissertation. And I think also that we'll find with these particular series that will be one of the series where the value will continue for a long time. The debate about the use of transnational, obviously, as many people have already said, will move on, but the value of this particular series is going to last for a long time in conjunction with whatever comes after it, I think. So, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, just trying to find the unmute button there. Okay, so I'm going to go to the chat, if that's all right with everyone, unless people wanted to come back specifically on Richard's or Charles's point. Perhaps I can read some of the comments in the chat and then colleagues can respond accordingly on all those points. Comment question from Manueli Santos in the chat. I'm wondering about the point raised by Julia regarding the role of departmental structures at universities in some locations, and those do vary from place to place, as well noted by another panelist. So the role that departmental structures at universities in some locations connect or shouldn't connect with how we develop knowledge with and about these cultures. I'm of course aware how much knowledge-making politics is connected with pressures of the day our work labour is materially grounded to. I'm just wondering about the role of this specific pressure regarding student numbers and disciplinary survival. Speaking from the UK, I feel the reality of departments being shut and the threat to knowledge making in the field that Charles referred to, but aren't those also very volatile in the long term of areas that have been there for so long, even if not established alongside teaching programs in the UK and Ireland? How can we afford making the epistemic justice we seek? What impact does it have on what we do?
Sorry, Julia. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much. It's been fantastic as always. Yeah, so I hear a lot of people talking about, of course, again, I understand that there is a history for this specific volume, but we're talking about the future of it and how we see, at least connected from a UK perspective, the future of this wonderful project, really, and how we can develop differently. How it does have a connection with, well, departmental structure, how, well, as colleagues said, how books are ordered to libraries, right? How we actually put those together, how do we keep a job? How can we justify that? And so on and so forth. So I was wondering that because we were talking about making a difference to deliver an epistemic justice, as Charles Forsdick said, but as Charles Burdett also said, we work with the institutions that we've got and we do have some compromises. So I'm just like thinking of these two things into consideration because, for example, I'm in Portuguese studies, not everywhere has Portuguese studies, but Portuguese studies exists nonetheless. Even if I'm not at Birmingham in the next 5 years, which I may not be. So I wonder how colleagues see that correlation, this pull and push between this materiality of our labor and how our work is connected to that, and us having jobs and having students or not having students, and how the fields are put together. Because I've been seeing people say, well, you have students and you don't have students, and other colleagues were saying, well, should we connect knowledge making with areas based on recruitment or not? That was the question. I'm sorry if I did misunderstand some of what is being said, but that's one of the things that I capture. If I did, that's absolutely fine. I'm sorry.
Did anyone want to comment on that? One of the things that's striking me, and I think Till mentioned this earlier on, just following this question by Manueli and the point Richard was raising about using the book in relation to students at every stage. It occurs to me we collaborate a lot as academics in publishing, but we do not tend to collaborate in teaching. And I think this is one of the, perhaps it speaks to your question slightly, Manueli, about the question around competition versus collaboration when it comes to our institutions and the kind of work we could feasibly do if there was more collaboration across our area, which is under threat. And I think maybe there's an opportunity within the context of that threat to collaborate more. That's just a thought that occurs to me. I don't know if anyone wants to come back on any of those points before we move on. Please, Charles. Yeah, thank you.
Joe, let me keep this brief because I know we're coming towards the end. But it's partly picking up on Manuela's question. I think to a certain extent, this series has got to be seen within longue durée, really. It's part of an evolution within the study of languages, cultures, and societies that's been sort of evolving since the 60s or 70s, really, when we moved away from literary emphasis, an emphasis on canonicity, and a sort of mimetic relationship to the way knowledge is constructed within the cultures we study, to something rather different. Diversification of object of study, emergence of post-colonialism, studying, researching more marginalized voices. So I think there's a direction of travel there, and it's got to be understood within that. The crucial thing, though, and I think this responds to the point you just made, Joe, is that there are differing contextual factors now. When I joined the profession, I would not sit down really in a situation with language-based area studies specialists. There was even a split across different language areas. And I think we've got to a healthy situation where those of us interested in the language disciplines are talking together a lot more. In the Anglophone world, I think as modern linguists, language-based area studies people, we're realizing that our domestic context is itself multilingual. And that gives us attraction in terms of what happens here as opposed to what happens there. And I think there are issues around interdisciplinarity as well, and the way that our fields can sort of drive interdisciplinarity in new ways. So it's a matter of sort of linking in with that. And this is Saskia's question in the chat is, I think, a really important one. Hilary's answered it in part already. Intermediality is important here. Attention to a broad range of objects of study. In our book, we look at comics, we look at video games, we look at statues, we look at museums. So there certainly is not literature as a default. But I also think it's that question about what do we do with the discipline? Do we reinvent new disciplinary areas, new programs, or do we try and work within the disciplines we've inherited? Now, I know that's a difficult question, particularly because there are a number of institutions which now or in the past have grappled with that and have been told by their management, actually, no, your discipline is no longer welcome here. But I think there is a question about how we actually take what we've inherited and innovate within that. But we need major policy changes. You know, the big problem in the UK as elsewhere is there is no centralized strategy around the subjects we're talking about in the way we need. And the health of our disciplines depends on institutional autonomy and decisions being taken at a local level.
Thank you, Charles, and thanks for picking up on Saskia's question in the chat. Any other comments before we close? We've got 3 minutes left.
I've always thought that languages for all could be used an awful lot more as well in a much more practical way, so that particularly now that it can be linked to European standards, or of course it could be with outside Europe. I'm afraid I still tend to think of that, so that employers know exactly what standards students are at, so that if someone an engineer comes in, for example, I'm glad with cousins who are an engineer and had to learn Japanese, so that so that the person who's not necessarily a language student sees the importance of it in their career, a different discipline, and then wants to learn it to a specific standard and be able to then, as it were, sell that, to an employer, because I think there are lots of practical applications for that.
Thank you, Maureen. I think that's increasingly common in my experience across languages for all, that it is mapped onto European framework for language learning. But thank you for that intervention. Well, it's really been a fascinating conversation and a fascinating session. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists today for taking the time and for such fascinating perspectives on their respective areas, but also how those areas can more meaningfully come together in the future, and indeed how that will be taken forward in the Transnational Modern Languages series. So I just wanted to thank everyone, and then indeed thanking the audience for coming in such big numbers and for your contributions to the discussion today.